Hello, everyone. This is Steve Christie, aka Born Again RN. I'm making this video to try to respond to those who believe in what's called the exceptions to abortion, meaning women who become, who conceive in rape, incest, and life of the mother. Because for a lot of people, they would be against abortion, but will ask, well, what do you do in these particular situations when the woman didn't have the choice to be conceived, or if there is a legitimate health threat, to the life of the mother. And often we respond with the truth, and we bring up the fact that abortion is the ending of the life of an innocent child. Nonetheless, it's not always received positively when we engage with people, because sometimes we forget the fundamental truth that even people who engage in abortion are created in the image of God. And we tend to sometimes ignore the trauma that the individual ends up going through, and they're often not heard. So, in this particular presentation, I'm not going to be responding so much to specific arguments from scripture, although I will be including some passages in scripture. It's going to be more how we can effectively respond to people so they understand that they're being heard. And with that, I'm going to get myself out of the way and put my presentation up about answering the difficult abortion questions from pro-choice groups. And as I had mentioned, one thing that's often overlooked is our need to be sensitive to women who've gone through an abortion or considering abortion. Maybe you've had one, someone who's listening to this, or is thinking about having an abortion. And as the Apostle Peter says, we have to remember to be gentle and reverent, while at the same time not compromising truth, because sometimes Christians will go the other directions and say, well, you went through this trauma and it's real and it's genuine and I'm acknowledging it, so it's okay that you went through an abortion, is and God's okay with that. And the fact is, God's not okay with that, but he is a loving and forgiving God. But at the same time, we have to remember that we can't compromise the truth of what God says in His Word, but there is a right and a wrong way of doing this. We have to remember to be gentle and reverent, like the Apostle Peter says. And we also have to remember, when we're engaging with individuals who might not agree with this on this particular topic, and maybe have gone through it themselves or known someone who's gone through it, we have to remember that we're trying to save lives and win souls. We're not trying to win a debate. And often we tend to forget that we're trying to win an argument, but sometimes we end up winning the battle, but we end up not winning the war. And again, we people want to know that we're listening to what they're saying, and that our responses are gentle and reverent as well as being truthful. So one of the questions that's often brought up is, or statements that's brought up, is that men shouldn't be involved in decisions affecting women. Yet in the 1973 Supreme Court justices who ruled uh, Roe versus Wade, 100% of them were men. They were all men. There wasn't one woman that was on this Supreme Court. So if men shouldn't be involved in decisions affecting women, should these nine men not have been involved in making that decision, in ruling in favor of Roe versus Wade? Well, compare that to the 2022 Supreme Court, which overturned Roe versus Wade, because not only were three women involved in this decision, meaning one third of the Supreme Court, but one woman was actually involved in overturning it. It was um, Amy what's her name? Amy Coney. Anyways, you can look it up. I can't remember what her name is off the top of my head. I knew it before I started. But compare this to the 1973 Supreme Court justices, where there weren't any men that were involved in this decision. Now, the argument usually will be that, well, this is different because these nine men ruled in favor of a woman's decision to have an abortion. But that's not what the argument is. The argument is men shouldn't be involved, period, in decisions affecting women. And there weren't any women on the Supreme Court that were involved. It was all men, regardless of the fact that they ruled in favor of a woman having abortions. rather than allowing it at the state level. Compare that to the 2022 Supreme Court, where one third of the Supreme Court involved women who were involved in overturning the 73 Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade. Furthermore, Norma McCorvey, who was the Roe and Roe versus Wade, uh, she had sought to overturn Roe versus Wade back in 2004, which she had originally advocated for in 1973, saying that it was the biggest mistake of her life. This is a quote attributed to her. And although she was allowed to be involved in this 1973 decision, in 2004, she was not granted to be involved to speak before the Supreme Court. So, how is this being consistent with allowing women to be involved in a decision like this? So especially the individual who was instrumental in the original case, and they allowed her to speak to the Supreme Court and to be involved. But then a later Supreme Court said that Roe was not allowed to be involved in the overturning of Roe versus Wade. This seems to be, um, inconsistent here. Unfortunately, she had died in 2017, which is 5 years before Roe versus Wade was overturned. But nonetheless, it was overturned, and it was overturned with Supreme Court justices, which included women, which the original did not. And this leads to a question, and I'm going to get rid of myself here because I'm kind of in the way. There, that's better. This leads to a question: how is a person's gender relevant to whether or not abortion should be legal and whether or not abortion is the ending of an innocent life, which is distinct from his or her mother's body? And this was a question that actually I brought up shortly after I became a Christian in August of 2004. I was still in nursing school, and a female friend of mine who was a fellow nursing student, I had asked her this question, and she had said to me, well, your gender has nothing to do with whether or not abortion is the ending of an innocent life. It would be no different if you were a woman than if you're a man. Your gender has nothing to do with that. And that's the real issue, is whether or not the life inside of the woman's body is the same as the woman's body, or if it is distinct. And she was the one who actually told me that it was distinct. And I made the comment to her, I says, well, what if something happened, heaven forbid, but if you got raped or incest, or your life was in danger, would this alter your decision? She said no, because the fate of my life would be no different than my baby's, and it doesn't change the fact that this is not part of my body. This is a different life inside of my body. So that's the thing that really nailed it for me early on as a baby Christian, and why I don't have a problem talking about this as a man, because my gender is irrelevant to the larger issue that's often ignored. Another question is, well, what if the majority of women believed abortion should be illegal or agreed with the overturning of Roe versus Wade? Would the pro choice community agree? Because as of right now, the argument goes something like this: that the majority of women do not believe abortion should be illegal, and they do not support the overturning of Roe versus Wade, even though arguably there are more women today that are against it, or at least against uh, abortion being legal in cases of consensual sex, and if the life of the mother is not in danger. But we're going to get to those exceptions in a little bit. But the point is, would the pro choice community agree that it should be illegal except for these cases, and should be if women themselves as a whole, or women, the majority of women would be against it? And if the pro choice community is being honest, they would say no, because it's not about what women believe. It's about pushing a particular agenda that goes against science, it goes against Christianity, it goes against God, and it actually goes against what the law should be, and what and the and what Roe versus Wade actually did, which took the power away from the states and gave it to the federal government, which the federal government should not be involved in this. And this leads to another question too. Would the pro-choice community advocate against abortion and ban and support a natural ban, provided the ban allowed for these three exceptions? The exceptions being conception from the result of rape, incest, and life of the mother. In other words, if we are talking to someone who is pro-choice advocate, and they'll say, well, abortion should be legal in the case of the danger to the life of the mother, or in the case of rape and incest. Well, then my response would be, okay, well, would you support a national ban on abortion, that it would be illegal to have an abortion if we provided an exception in the law for allowing abortion for rape, incest, and life of the mother? Now, most pro choice advocates would say no. Well, if the answer is no, then why bring up these three exceptions for? And that's because they're not concerned about the three exceptions. They just want abortion to be legal. And they're simply using this to elicit an emotional response to get away from the larger issue. Plus, at least at one point, only about 1% of abortions result from any of these three um, exceptions. And by exceptions, I'm talking about that these are exceptional because it's very rare compared to conceptions as a whole. In most cases, 90 to 99% of cases, conception is not the result of rape, it's not the result of incest, and the mother's life is not in danger. So, but we'll get to these three exceptions a little bit later and how to address them. So, are these exceptions justification for ending an innocent life? And this is the main issue: is recognizing that the life inside of a child, inside of a mother, is innocent. So the individual inside of that's conceived inside of the mother had nothing to do with his or her conception. The life inside of the mother did not rape the mother and did not put the mother's body or life at risk. This is something that happened by no fault of the baby inside. The other issue is rape and incest worse than murder? So, in other words, if you had to rank rape and incest and murder, where would you rank it? And for a lot of people, they would say, yeah, rape and incest is not worse than murder. But then again, they're saying that ending the life of an innocent child is not as bad as the woman being raped. And I would say both, in both situations, it's horrific and it's horrible. But is rape and incest really worse than murder? Is not allowing an innocent life that had nothing to do with the woman getting raped, is that uh, more acceptable than than the horrific thing that happened to the mother? And I would say no at that, and I'm going to explain why in a little bit. But again, we have to be careful when we engage with individuals who have either been through this experience or are considering it or have known someone, because as the apostle Peter rightly stated in his first epistle, in chapter 3 verse 15, sanctified Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And this is a thing that as Christians we often forget to do. We forget to be gentle and reverent when dealing with someone who has gone through this trauma, and we need to acknowledge the personal trauma a woman goes through when she's not only been raped, um, but she's also conceived the child with this horrific individual. Or if her life is genuinely in danger, we need to acknowledge the fact that she's legitimately scared, and not only scared for herself but for her unborn child, who she might want to have. In other words, if a woman's life is in a risk like an ectopic pregnancy, they may want to have this child, but then they have to make the most difficult decision of their life. And this is something we often forget: is that it's not always an easy decision. In most cases, it's not. They're making the most difficult decision of their life because they know they're ending the life of an innocent child. So we have to be careful about being sensitive, but at the same time, not sacrificing the truth. As a matter of fact, someone I know who had admitted that she had been gang raped, and I won't reveal her name just out of respect and privacy. But when I responded to her, I had to make sure to be careful and I had to be sensitive while at the same time wording my response about not sacrificing the truth from God's word. And my response was like this. I said, God is both merciful and just. Your perpetrator who brought that innocent life into the world will be judged for his sins, or in this case, their sins, because it was more than one. God is merciful to that innocent life, and he or she is in heaven right now with God. May God grant you peace and his love and forgiveness through his son. So, in this statement, I didn't simply just say, you can't advocate your abortion simply because you were gang raped. That would be insensitive. That would not be gentle. That wouldn't be showing reverence. That wouldn't be showing any type of sensitivity. While at the same time, I use specific wording that God is merciful. Even though we deserve punishment, God is merciful and he doesn't carry out his punishment on us because otherwise he would have to kill all of us because we've all sinned against a holy God and yet God allows us to live anyway. At the same time, he's just. If there is something that ends up happening against us that's wrong, God will punish the perpetrator. In this case, the ones who had gang raped, this innocent woman. But at the same time, also mentioning that an innocent life was brought into the world. And it doesn't matter how an individual comes into the world, they're still an innocent life. They're just like the mother, the child is created in the image of God. And sometimes people tend to forget that. But there's a right and wrong way of doing this. And also emphasize the fact the perpetrator will be judged for his sins, and I emphasized innocent life again, and also to emphasize the fact that this individual, whether it's a he or a she, and we would know that by the sex chromosomes if we were able to check, uh, the unborn child, at conception, he or she's in heaven right now, and we know this because again, even unborn children are created in the image of God, and the Bible describes children as being innocent in a way that adults are not. They're conceived in sin. The psalmist makes this very clear in Psalm 51, but they are not judged in the same way that we're not. And that's what innocent means. It means without judgment. And that's because Jesus died on the cross for the stain of an original sin that was passed down to Adam through all human beings. And then I finished up by saying, God may grant you the peace and love and forgiveness through his son. And the key thing is that God loves the whole world, that he gave his only begotten son. So whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have eternal life. And he will grant forgiveness to all those who believe through his son. And this is why it's so important because we're engaging with individuals who have experienced this sort of trauma and have to make the most difficult decision of their life, knowing that they're ending the life of an innocent child. God will grant forgiveness for that sin of abortion, but more importantly, he will forgive us if we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ and that we believe his death and shed blood on the cross were sufficient for our salvation. And that's the bigger picture here. Again, we're not trying to win battles, we're trying to win souls. And we sometimes forget that. So, one question that's often brought up with the whole rape and incest thing is pregnancy from the result of rape and incest worse than ending the innocent life distinct from his or her mother's life? Well, all you have to do is see the sex chromosomes of an unborn baby boy because the mother's sex chromosomes are XX. A baby boy's sex chromosomes are XY, and this is true whether they are inside the womb or outside the womb. In fact, at the moment of conception, which is what the Bible supports, the conceived baby, if it's a boy, will have that XY chromosome because it's not just the mother's chromosomes they inherit, but they also inherit the Y chromosome from the father, and that's what makes the unborn baby distinct from his mother. So it's a combination of the parents, but still makes them a distinct individual. Now, in the case of a baby girl, they have X sex chromosomes just like her mother does, but the girl is not a clone of the mother. The girl is still a distinct individual from the mother because the other X chromosome they don't get from the mother, they get from the father. In fact, if you take a look at fraternal twins in the womb, even if they're both girls, they're not identical. They are distinct from one another in addition to being distinct from the mother. And even if they're identical twins, they're still distinct from the mother because they get that X chromosome from the father. Now, one of the responses I've heard is, well, I didn't give consent to be raped and conceive a child. And they're absolutely right. They did not give consent to be raped and conceive a child. Nonetheless, the child was not the one who raped his mother, it was somebody else. So the question is, should we punish the child for the crime that the father had committed against the mother? And I'm using the word father strictly as a definitional term, not as any type of paternal right that the rapist actually has. I mean, so I want to make it clear I'm using it that way. But it's in other words, it's not the mother's fault she got raped, but it's not the child's fault she got raped either. So just as the mother should not be punished for what happened to her, the child also should not be punished what happened to her. Yet in abortion, that's exactly what happened. And this leads to the next question. Should abortion be legal only for conception resulting from non consensual sex? In other words, should consensual sex that results in conception be illegal? Because if the argument is, I should be able to have an abortion and it should be moral to have an abortion because I didn't um, give consent, it was non-consensual, then should abortion only be legal if if conception results from this non-consensual sex? But if a mother has consensual sex, she agrees to have sex and gets an abortion, and wants to get an abortion, should that be illegal? So because that's what that statement above that says I didn't give consent to be raped and conceive a child would lead to, because it's strictly dealing with non-consensual sex. But it would then follow, then would consensual sex, would that be legal if it results in conception? Well, obviously not. So that's not a good argument that non-consensual sex is the only thing that should be legal. To continue on with the whole rape and incest thing, I was trying to think of an example um, that I could use, because the response usually is, I did not have the opportunity to say no, and so therefore um, I should be able to have an abortion because it was against my will and I didn't have the opportunity. But would there be a situation where a woman not only would not be able to give consent for being raped, but also not have the ability to have an abortion after she was raped and conceived a child? Would she then later be able to have would she then be able to end the life of this child after the child is born if she was given that opportunity? And I was thinking about this movie that my wife and I saw a few years ago called Girl in the Basement. If you haven't seen it, it stars Judd Nelson from The Breakfast Club. It came out in 2021. It's a very disturbing and a very horrific movie, but it's actually based on a true story, which I believe took place in Austria. And the movie involves a man who had locked up his daughter in a bunker in his basement for 20 years. And then during this time he went on to rape her several times, and she ended up conceiving and gave birth to several children. Now in the movie, what ends up happening is that some of the children she ended up not being able to give birth because they were stillbirths because of the abuse that she incurred from her father. And in the movie, you can actually see that even after she gave birth and she was disturbed by the fact this child was the result of the union between her and her father, she nonetheless went on over the years to actually love these children, because she realized that these children were still hers. And when she later revealed this to her children and told her that their grandfather was actually their father also. He said it doesn't She said it doesn't change the fact I love you no matter what, regardless of how you came into the world. But the point is, she did not have the opportunity to have an abortion because she was locked in this bunker in this basement. So that leads to the question, since she didn't consent to be raped or conceive a child, would she then have the right to end the life of her child after they were born? Because what ended up happening is her oldest child, her daughter, end up getting really sick, and she ended up telling her father, who conceived this child with her, that she needed to go to a hospital. And it was the first time in 20 years that he allowed her to be released in order for uh, the daughter to seek medical attention. But what so here's the thing, she didn't have the right, or she didn't have the opportunity to have an abortion because she didn't have the opportunity to she didn't give consent to be raped. So since she didn't have the opportunity to have the abortion, would it then be legal to commit infanticide due to her being raped? So in other words, should infanticide be legal due to rape? In other words, could a woman moments after giving birth say, you know what, I decide I don't want to have this child after all? Or in the case of this girl who was prevented from having an abortion, could she say, okay, I'm free now, and I've got this newborn baby here, and I want to I want to end the life of this innocent child because I didn't have the opportunity to do it before because I was locked in this bunker. So this is just a very strange and horrible and unique situation, but it addresses the larger picture here. If the answer is no, she should not be granted to commit infanticide and end the life of this children. What difference does it make if the child that was born, which was a result of conception and rape, versus being conception and rape and having an abortion in the womb? Geography should not matter. And one real life example of conception and rape is a woman by the name of Rebecca Kiessling. If you don't know who she is, her website is on the screen here, and I'll put it in the description below the video. And Rebecca Kiessling was a young lady who was conceived and raped. In other words, her mother had been raped by a man, and because it was illegal in the state she was in at the time, I believe at the time it was in Michigan, she was unable to obtain a legal abortion, and she didn't want to have an illegal abortion because of the safety of that. And that's one thing we have to remember, is when a woman goes through an abortion, it's not like she's not at risk. Her life is in danger when she has an abortion, her health is at risk when she has an abortion, and even if she has an abortion and wants to have other children, many times she's not able to have children afterwards. So Rebecca, she was conceived and raped in 1988, and she was born in 1969. And because it was illegal at the time, because it was 5 years, or I should say 4 years before Roe versus Wade, she was given up for an adoption. I've got the word adoption in boldface because we tend to forget that adoption is an option for that to happen. Like the woman that was locked in the basement, if she had wanted to, she could have given her children up for adoption. She ended up keeping them because she grew to love them as her own child because they were her own children. But that is an option for adoption, and as a result, you don't go through the mental turmoil knowing that you ended the life of an innocent child that had nothing to do with his or her conception. And this is something that Rebecca came to accept, because one of the things she's been quoted as saying is, if I had been aborted, I would be dead right now. And she's right, because when you end the life of an innocent child, that child is no longer alive, the children is dead. And one of the things that really disturbed her, as well as a lot of other women, is that are conceived in rape, because she's not the only one, as they're sometimes referred to as a rapist baby. And she says, I am not the rapist baby, because the man who raped her mother, it's not just his genes and chromosomes that make up Rebecca Kiesling. It's also her mother's. She is a combination of her mother and her father, not just the quote unquote rapist babies. So it's incorrect to say that, and it's a bit of a pejorative to refer to uh, babies who have been conceived as rape as being the rapist babies. Rebecca has since gone on to be an advocate for the pro-life movement, including conception resulting from rape or incest, and she has room to talk. She is has the right to be involved in this as a woman, as someone that was conceived in rape, and men and other women who agree with her, are agreeing with her largely because of what she's saying is true. Even men who agree with her should not be condemned, saying you don't have the right to say this, that a woman shouldn't get an abortion because of rape or incest. They're simply agreeing with someone who was conceived in rape. So so they're actually attacking someone like Rebecca as opposed to those who agree with her. The other thing is that she actually led her birth mother to Christ, and this is the part that's often overlooked, and it's so important because we tend to forget our function and our purpose here on earth as Christians is to lead people to the Lord, just as other people led us to the Lord. And she um, was given up for adoption. She ended up finding her biological mother, and she led her mother to Christ. Now, think to yourself, and she's led countless other people to Christ because of her ministry and because of her experience and because of her story. Think how many people would not have been led to the Lord if it wasn't for Rebecca Kiessling, if she had been uh, killed and she had been aborted by her mother, but because she was given up for adoption, she's led countless people to Christ. Now, I want to move on to incest because there's more to this than even rape because it involves a family member here. One of the arguments is conception resulting from close relatives can cause birth defects such as Down syndrome and other effects. And so this is an argument that's made that it's not only was the mother raped, but also she has to deal with the fact that she could have high risk of birth defects of the child because of the mother and father being so close in terms of family. But the problem is that ends up committing a slippery slope because should we then make it illegal for unborn children who have birth defects to be born? Because in the 1940s, Nazi Germany, this is something that they had done. They did what's called racial cleansing. They wanted the most perfect type of human beings. And if there was any risk of birth defects, um, they would just end up killing the child in the womb, regardless of the sex resulted in consent or not. And you see this um, even in different forms of of creating like the perfect human being. And we have to remember that um, even if a woman or a man is older and at higher risk of having a baby with their birth defects, the question is, should it be illegal to have one? So, in other words, once you pass the age of 40, whether you're a woman or if you're a man and you want to have a child, it puts you at risk of your child having birth defects, such as Down syndrome. And I have personally known of people who had children when they were in their 40s. Children had birth defects, and they were still the most loving individuals. So the point being is, in the case of incest, that should not be a reason um, for getting an abortion because there's a high risk of birth defects, because in a normal pregnancy there are risks of birth defects as well. So that's not a good reason when it comes to incest. Another thing too is that there are some states, I believe, where the state constitution allows close relatives like cousins or distant cousins to have children, get married and have children. So now you're talking constitutionally. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but nonetheless, if it is something that is legal and it's something that individuals desire to do, um, just because they're close like that, that shouldn't prevent them from being able to do that if that's the law in the particular state. And that's the reason why abortion should be decided at the state level, decided by the voters, as opposed to the federal government putting a national ban or preventing a national ban, like in the case of Roe versus Wade, which was unconstitutional. Now, the last one is the mother's life is in danger or the health of the mother. So, in other words, here's a situation where the mother may have wanted to have the child, they had conceived the child, but then they're told by their physician that the child is at high, not the child is high risk, but the mother is at high risk, and the health of the mother and the life of the mother is in danger. The problem is the term health of the mother isn't just limited to physical health of the mother or the physical life of the mother. It can include emotional, mental, and even financial. In other words, the law for the health of the mother means if the mother feels that they cannot financially support the child, that they end up having consensual sex and conceive this child, they can abort the baby because it defines as health of the mother, or if they're emotionally or mentally unfit to have this child. So in other words, don't just carry the child through and have and give the child up for adoption, but you can abort the baby in this particular situation. So the health of the mother can be a very slippery slope. Another thing is that the prognosis is often uncertain or even wrong. In fact, normal pregnancy has risks, and this is something we tend to forget. When a woman goes through a pregnancy, there's a lot of risks that take place. A lot of times, women have to end up going on bed rest, they get sick, there's a lot of other issues that can happen, and they can end up not having the baby. How often do we find out that women will, when they uh, conceive a child with their husband, they don't always report right away that they're pregnant because they have to get through the high risk period first. Why is that? Because normal pregnancy has risks. So so a normal pregnancy, just like a high risk pregnancy, is not a reason to get an abortion because pregnancy in general has risks. Now, of course, the one that often pops up is ectopic pregnancy. It's something that's very unusual. I think it's less than like 1/10 or 1/100th of 1% of all pregnancies, but it is something that does happen, and we need to acknowledge this. And again, we mustn't condemn, but we should still acknowledge in this particular situation what we have to say is, um, even if a woman ends up having an abortion because her and her baby are both at high risk because the baby would not survive an ectopic pregnancy, we mustn't condemn the individual. We have to emphasize God will forgive you for that, but at the same time acknowledging that you're ending the life of an innocent child who nonetheless would have likely ended up not being able to survive, and the mother may not able to survive. So would I condemn a woman who had an abortion as a result of ectopic pregnancy that put risk to her and her child? No, but at the same time, we should also acknowledge what an abortion is, and tell that mother, if you genuinely feel bad about having the abortion, go to Christ, ask God for forgiveness, and He will forgive you for that, because you too are created in the image of God. The acknowledgement of what the abortion is still important to communicate, but to do so gently and do so with reference. Now, I try to think of a scenario of this where a woman would actually give birth and might be put in the same situation. Let's say, for instance, a woman gives birth and she's walking down the street with her newborn baby, and a shooter comes forward and forces her to choose between either ending her life or the life of her child, or she has to choose between either ending um, her baby's life or both the life of her and her child. In other words, he could come forward, he could say one of two things. He could say, okay, I have a bullet here, and either your baby's going to take it or you're going to take it. What is the mother going to do? Or say, I'm either going to shoot your baby, and if you or you, and if you don't choose between you and your baby, I'm going to shoot the both of you. So, in other words, the baby is still going to die regardless, but the mother is going to end up dying too. Because in the case of an abortion from an ectopic pregnancy, only the baby dies. Would the mother choose for the shooter to murder just her child? I would say in most scenarios, no, because the motherly instinct would it would kick in and say, "You're not going to kill my baby," because she realizes that she's going to have to live with the decision the rest of her life that she's living while her baby died. She'd rather die with her child. In fact, it reminds me of the movie Passion of the Christ. And there's a scene. It's not in the Bible, but it's a moving scene where Jesus is dying on the cross, and Mary ends up coming to the feet of Jesus and says, let me die with you. And that's the natural response a mother is going to have. And we also have to remember that in certain cases, I don't know if it's still legal now, but at one time, that if a shooter killed a mother and her baby in the womb, it would not be considered a homicide. It would be considered a double murder. And that's because life in the womb, life inside the womb, is a human person. It's a human being, regardless of what Roe versus Wade says. And it, in this scenario, people will say, "Well, um, she consented to have uh, sex and conceive this child. She wanted this child, and that's the difference." But it's really not the difference because it ignores the fact that the life inside the womb is still human, regardless of consent or not. So the question is, what would a woman do? A woman would say, "I go ahead and kill both of us because you're going to kill my child anyway. So what difference does it mean make if the child is inside the womb or outside the womb? It's still the ending of an innocent life. But again, we don't condemn because of the trauma the individual goes through, but we still acknowledge what's actually still happening and to do so in a very gentle and reverent way. An example of uh, a mother's life being in danger is Tim Tebow's mother. If you've not familiar with Tim Tebow, he was a quarterback for the Denver Broncos. As a matter of fact, his Broncos end up beating my beloved Pittsburgh Steelers in the playoffs when Tebow was quarterback, well, for the Denver Broncos. But what ended up happening is that Tim Tebow's mother had a life-threatening displaced um, placenta during the pregnancy, and he wrote a book back in 2021 called Tim Tebow through my eyes. And he was telling the story of when his mother was pregnant with him, and she had made the comment. She says the only way to save your life is to have an abortion. This is what her doctor supposedly told her, and she ended up surviving. She was put on bed rest, and in the book it says the doctor says that it was a miracle baby, referring to Tim Tebow, and only a small part of the placenta was attached, but it was just enough to keep your baby nourished all these months. And that's why I made the comment on the previous screen that when it comes to life of the mother or danger of the mother, the prognosis is often uncertain, and it's more or less a best guess. And so mothers are making decisions based on probability, not on for sure situations. But Tim Tebow's mother, despite having this light threatening displaced placenta during her pregnancy, she said that her fate would be no different than my child's. And as a result, Tim Tebow's mother survived, and Tim witnessed for and led people to Christ, just as Rebecca Kiessling did. So here's another example. If Tim Tebow had not survived, countless people would not have been led to Christ, which is the real reason why we're here. And we often get distracted by negative things that happen to us. And even the word Timothy in Greek means honoring God. And both Tim and Tim's mother both honored God through their testimony of this trauma that they had gone through. So, just kind of a summary of everything that I had mentioned. One, gender is irrelevant to abortion being murder, including being involved in ruling against it. And we saw this with the two Supreme Court cases. The original Supreme Court of Roe versus Wade was a woman wasn't involved in that ruling, so it goes against that argument. While the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022, women were involved in that ruling, and one of those women ruled against it. Number two, conception from rape, incest, and life of the mother aren't justifiable reasons for abortion since it's still murder. And these exceptions only result in about 1% of all conceptions anyway. Number three, always remember to be gentle and reverent. And this is a part that I really want to emphasize and I stress through this whole thing when engaging with women who are contemplating an abortion. First Peter 3:15. Because we have to remember we're trying to save lives and souls, not win debates. And Rebecca Kiessling and Tim Tebow are excellent examples of that, and to encourage and support ultrasounds at pregnancy centers. This is something I didn't bring up during the discussion or the presentation, but in Northwest Ohio, which is where I live, we have a pregnancy center and they have ultrasounds, and I would highly encourage when we talk with individuals who are contemplating an abortion, or if someone's listening to this and is thinking about it, do yourself a favor, do your baby a favor, go get an ultrasound, because and a person goes and gets an ultrasound and actually sees the human being that's got a head and eyes and hands and feet and everything else, they're less likely to have an abortion because they're visualizing and seeing that it's actual human being. It's not just a clump of cells. In fact, I put a 4D image on my YouTube channel recently, or not my YouTube channel, but on my Facebook page, and it really shows from a 4D image how human the unborn baby looks at just a few weeks after conception. It's unbelievable. Lastly, I'm putting this on because even though this is a political meme, I'm actually putting it on to emphasize that abortion is not a is a biblical issue. It's not a political issue. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the question usually comes up: what happens when both parties support these three exceptions: rape, incest, and life of the mother? And this is something that can be um, conflicting for people that are trying to decide, when, especially when both parties end up supporting this. And we have to understand that Christians are not one or two issue voters. Often we're accused of only voting for a candidate um, if they're against abortion, and if they believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. And if I'm going to put a link on the screen in the description below at the end of my interview with Mike Popst, when we I mentioned there's multiple issues that Christians need to consider, not just about abortion and marriage, even though those are two very important issues. In fact, the majority of the discussion was about abortion, so you can look at that. And I provided timestamps so you can jump to particular links like about abortion or other issues if you want to look into that more detail. But the point being is that it's not a political issue, it's a biblical issue. And when we go to the polls, we need to consider this, but we have to remember that we're electing a president or a politician in a different office as opposed to electing a pastor. So we have to go with the candidate that's closest to the individual, but we should still get out and vote. In fact, I was just hearing on Christian radio earlier today, something like 40% of Christians don't vote. Well, if you don't vote, what you end up doing is you end up allowing people in office who you disagree with even more on particular issues like this. And this is the reason why rulings like Roe versus Wade happened in the first place. And it's the reason why our parties have gone more and more and further away from God and the Bible and even morality, because Christians aren't voting. So again, even though this is not a political issue, it's a biblical issue. It's something that affects us, who have had it affects us because Christians in the past who fought so hard for our freedoms to be able to vote, in order for us to continue to have these freedoms, including the freedom of an unborn child to be protected in the place where it should be protected, in his mother's womb. It's the reason why we're in the situation to begin with. And can it be reversed with God's grace? It can be. So thank you for everyone who's listened this far. It's a little longer than I had planned, but take a look at the link that I'm going to have later on. I'm going to put links in the description below of some of the things I talked about, and please share this with people who might be considering having an abortion, or known people, or not too sure how to address people on the three exceptions when it comes to abortion of rape, incest, or life of the mother. And hopefully, it'll give you something. This is giving you something to think about. So, thank you. God bless you, and stay safe out there.